In this modern age of modern music, with very highly produced sounds in drums and everywhere else, we start sometimes to lose track of what drums acoustically in a room actually sound like. So today, we're going to pull back the veil on just how much can be done to shape the sound of otherwise okay sounding drums. Well, the short answer is a lot, because the thing about drums is there is a big difference between super boomy, super resonant, super unmuffled drums and the most maxed out, crushed, flattened, lifeless drums that we can make. This has nothing to do with your particular drums that you own, the brand, the make, the model, the heads you're using. There's all sorts of things that fit in the cracks of every possible combination. We need to say up front, first of all, that this is not a tutorial video about tuning, mixing, production, nothing like that at all. This is merely a demonstration of us trying to get basically the deadest, most lifeless drum sound that we can, and showing you the capacity in post, in mixing, everything else, to get the sound that we hear in a lot of modern music, particularly metal and other things like that, where it needs to really cut through. Today we're going to work in reverse order from what we often do, and we're going to show you the final product first. Let's hear some single hits and some groove with the fully processed final sound. This sounds reminiscent of a lot of modern, powerful, punchy, very lively drum sounds that we hear in modern music, particularly again in rock and metal and heavier hitting scenarios where you're competing with a lot of other instruments, and it requires a ton of articulate, sharp punchiness to get through. Now let's start to walk back what we did to these sounds to get to where we finally ended up with this previous demonstration. Normally on this show, if you've been with us for any amount of episodes, you know that we stand by raw, unadulterated drum sounds. So let's hear the raw, unadulterated drum sounds of the example that you just heard. If you're curious about the exact procedure we went to build the final sound today, head over to the Patreon via the link below. At the Dynasonic level, we're going to provide you with a walkthrough of each of the steps that went from the raw drum sounds to the final sound that you heard at the beginning of the video. Okay, so let's talk it down. The snare has basically no overtones present. The wires are choked. It's tuned pretty high. Not in love with that sound. The toms have no sustain of any kind. They're just punch, punch, punch. Not a lot of tone, not really much of anything going on there. We're also hearing a consistent humming overtone coming from the rack tom basically anytime I hit the snare. So if I'm playing a groove, it's singing that note the whole time. Last but not least, the bass drum is dead. We have a big pillow in there. It's pressed against both heads. It's punchy, but it doesn't have a lot of power inside of the beat. All of these elements together get us a pretty lackluster drum sound that sitting in a mix wouldn't sound good and frankly isn't particularly inspiring to play acoustically in front of me or when listening back from a recording. Now, if you heard the initial sound after all of the production and really liked what you were hearing, that doesn't make you crazy. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. That is a great sounding produced drum sound. What we're looking at here is just how far removed that final sound can be from where we started. Additionally, that final sound doesn't represent, frankly, any acoustic, unadulterated drum sound that I've ever heard, because a huge portion of what you're hearing is specifically about the production that goes into it. There are plenty of examples in popular music and elsewhere that began with great sounding drums that also received a fairly tremendous amount of post-production to get a great result in the end. What this means for us is that the better the drums sound before we start to produce them, the more options and better luck we're going to have in the end with having some options and versatility in the final sound. It's worth noting that starting with these drum sounds meant that we actually had to spend kind of a lot of time dialing them in, massaging the sound, and adding different sorts of post-production to get them to that final stage. Whereas if they were tuned and created a great tone in the first place, even with a little bit of muffling, it would mean we wouldn't have to do so much on the back end to get to a great sound. In preparing for making this episode, we watched several tutorials online by big name artists working in this heavy rock space, and that afforded us the opportunity to hear both the way that they go through production and also the raw sounds that they were working with. And frankly, it was shocking both just how, to us at least, unpleasant the raw sounds were, and how many levels of production it took just on the snare drum alone to achieve the final sound that you hear on the record. It could not have been more different. This is the sort of thing that really clouds our ears and our brains when it comes to what we can expect from an acoustic instrument, what it's capable of, and what we can have in front of us for practicing, for playing live, and for recording when we hear these kinds of sounds day in and day out through our headphones. We start to get into a space where we can't relate to the acoustic sound anymore because our expectations have shifted based on listening to hyper-produced, hyper-compressed, EQ'd, and the rest of it drum sounds on the records that we like. It's very rare that any of us gets the opportunity to be in the room with a band we love, whose record we're going to listen to later, and hear just what was happening in the tracking room, and then in the mixing process, and then ultimately the final product. It's anybody's guess what our favorite drummer's drums actually sound like. It's very rare that you hear drum sounds in the room, live and acoustic, that sound and hit you the same way when they're coming out of speakers after they've been recorded. There's a lot that happens in between those microphones and the ultimate product, setting aside post-production. So anytime we're listening to a record, we can get somewhere between a good sense of how those drums sounded and no sense at all because of how much production could have gone into that process. And unless we're in the room while it's happening and then in the room while they're mixing it, it's very hard to tell where they started versus where they ended up. This phenomena also comes into play when dealing with listening to and purchasing products that maybe you can't hear directly in front of you. At the end of the day, companies trying to sell you a product, well, it's in their best interest to make it sound great so that you're going to want to buy it. And there's no rule that says that they can't EQ, compress, do whatever they want to do to make their product sound as good as possible to the end user to elevate your desire to have that sound for yourself. This type of thing can also lead us to become hypercritical of the things that we hear and start to not trust any of it, which could limit the likelihood that we might get a product that could be really useful for us because we don't trust it, or frankly take us out of the market entirely and leave us wondering what we might want to get if we do want a bit of new inspiration. Hopefully this allows you to get a more realistic set of expectations about both how your drums might sound at home at the tuning skill level that you currently have, and also how close you might be to the actual sounds that are on the record that you'd love to be emulating. The more we practice these things, the better we get at tuning, but never forget that sometimes these goals are not about the acoustic drums themselves and about other things that have nothing to do with the sounds that we're hearing in front of us.